Okay, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a moment in history that honestly plays out like a high-stakes political thriller. We're talking about the tea that ended apartheid, Mandela and Botha's secret meeting. We're going to approach this incredible story like documentary filmmakers today, taking you right inside the room to unpack the massive deadlock and reveal the exact moment that completely altered the course of South Africa. It's an absolute masterclass in negotiation, so let's jump right into the moment of peak tension.
So picture this, it's 1985. The South African government has actually offered Nelson Mandela his freedom, but there's a huge catch. He has to unconditionally reject violence as a political weapon. And after over 20 years in prison, you'd think he'd take it, right? But listen to his response. His words are read out loud by his daughter, Zinzi, to a roaring crowd of 70,000 people at Jabulani Stadium in Soweto. He flat out rejects the offer. He famously declares, "Only free men can negotiate. Prisoners cannot enter into contracts." It's just an unbelievable display of defiance. But it really begs the question, why on earth did the government suddenly want to negotiate with their most famous prisoner in the first place?
Well, to understand why, we have to look at what was happening outside the prison walls. The government desperately needed a conversation because South Africa was, quite literally, a nation on fire. Black uprisings were spreading rapidly. On top of that, the international community had hit the country with crippling economic sanctions that were just suffocating the economy. The government's response? They clamped down hard with a strict state of emergency and doubled down on a ruthless military and police strategy called total onslaught. I mean, the stakes were literally life and death here. The country was completely gridlocked, and a secret backdoor conversation was basically the only way out.
So, let's look at the room and the stakes. Who exactly is stepping into this high-wire act, and what do they stand to lose? On one side, you have State President P.W. Botha. They called him the Great Crocodile. He's the supreme head of state security, viewed globally as the enforcer of tyrannical racial oppression. And on the other side, Nelson Mandela, the saint, the imprisoned leader and the ultimate symbol of African resistance. For both of these guys, just meeting was incredibly dangerous. Botha's hardline supporters would absolutely see this as caving to a terrorist organization, and Mandela's worldwide supporters? They'd have a really hard time believing he was secretly having tea with the very architect of their suffering.
And you've got to picture where this took place, because it wasn't some neutral, boring conference room. On July 5, 1989, Mandela is secretly driven from his prison cell to Tuynhuys. That's the stately 18th century presidential office in Cape Town, which was, for all intents and purposes, a monument to white supremacy. It is such a surreal thing to imagine. Mandela, who is still 7 months away from his actual release, walking right into the nerve center of the regime that kept him locked in a cage for nearly 3 decades.
I really want you to think about the psychological weight of this. Getting these two bitter adversaries into the same room is mind-boggling. It's the classic paradox, right? What actually happens when an unstoppable force, the African liberation movement, finally meets the immovable object of the apartheid state?
Obviously, this impossible meeting didn't just happen overnight. The long road to that room took years of insanely delicate, highly classified maneuvering. After rejecting that release offer in 1985, Mandela took a massive, calculated risk. He secretly reached out to the government himself from his cell. By 1988, Botha's intelligence chief, a guy named Neil Barnard, started visiting Mandela. And get this, Barnard and Mandela had over 60 secret meetings just to lay the groundwork. Barnard basically had to convince Botha that sitting down with Mandela was a win-win, a desperate chance to find a peaceful settlement before the whole country just tore itself apart.
But getting them into the room was just half the battle. They immediately slammed right into a massive deadlock. The clash of egos and the rigid preconditions were just staggering. For years, the government's stance was immovable. Mandela must unconditionally renounce violence before we even talk. On the flip side, Mandela and the ANC demanded the government legalize the ANC, release all political prisoners, and dismantle apartheid entirely. These were basically irreconcilable ideologies. Nobody wanted to be the first to blink.
And knowing Botha's famously explosive temper, Intelligence Chief Neil Barnard was terrified this whole thing was going to blow up in his face. Literally moments before Mandela walks into the president's office, Barnard gives him some incredibly strict instructions. He says, "Listen, this is an icebreaker meeting. Don't mention the issue of Walter Sisulu." Sisulu was Mandela's closest friend and a fellow political prisoner. Barnard knew that if Mandela pushed Botha on releasing prisoners right out of the gate, the crocodile would snap, he'd say no, and this whole historic opportunity would be dead on arrival.
So, the moment arrives, July 5th, 1989. Mandela steps into the grand office, and what happens next is so incredibly human, it's almost hard to believe. According to Mandela's own autobiography, Botha didn't pull a power move. He didn't make Mandela walk all the way across the room to his desk like some subservient prisoner. Instead, Botha walked exactly halfway across his grand office to meet him in the middle. He had his hand out, smiling broadly. With that one simple human gesture, the ice was completely broken. Botha was actually unfailingly courteous.
Okay, so here is the breakthrough. How did these two guys actually find common ground? Well, they don't start by yelling about apartheid. Mandela, who is just a brilliant strategist, had really done his homework. He brings up the 1914 Afrikaner Rebellion. This is a piece of history that was deeply, deeply personal to Botha's own people. Mandela basically connected the African struggle for freedom directly to the Afrikaners' historical struggle against the British. He reframed this bloody, existential conflict not as a war with terrorists, but as a quarrel between brothers who just happened to be different colors. It's a stunning pivot. And this tactical empathy worked flawlessly. Botha was blown away by Mandela's grasp of Afrikaner history. The exact realization that changed the outcome of the meeting, and probably the entire country, is captured in something Botha later told an opposition politician. Speaking about Mandela, he admitted, "I can understand the old man. I don't know what I would have done." By validating Botha's history, Mandela essentially forced Botha to see the humanity and the undeniable logic in his own struggle. So sensing the mood in the room had really softened, Mandela decides to take a massive, calculated risk. He looks at Botha and does exactly what Neil Bernard begged him not to do. He asks for the release of his friend, Walter Sisulu. Bernard must have been sweating bullets, just waiting for the explosion. But against all odds, Botha just listens. He turns to his intelligence chief and says, "I think we must help him." No way, right? The architect of apartheid just agreed to do a favor for his most famous prisoner.
Now, there were no treaties signed that day over tea, but the psychological dam had totally burst. Mandela later wrote about how Botha had long talked about the need to cross the Rubicon, but never did it until that morning in Twain Heights. This was the moment that finally shattered the master and servant dynamic that had defined race relations in South Africa for centuries. They were speaking to each other finally as equals. As Mandela said, there was absolutely no turning back. And the ripple effect of this one meeting was just staggering. It moved at lightning speed. Literally the next month, August 1989, P.W. Botha suddenly resigns as state president. His successor, F.W. de Klerk, takes the baton and sprints with it. By February 1990, de Klerk does the unthinkable and officially unbans the ANC. Just days after that, Nelson Mandela walks free after 27 years behind bars. That quiet, completely secret dialogue in Tweenhuis was the direct foundation for the democratic transition of an entire nation.
It really is an astonishing record of patience, of brilliant strategy, and just immense courage. And it leaves us with something really profound to think about. If P.W. Botha, the fierce enforcer of state security, and Nelson Mandela, a man robbed of 27 years of his life, could sit down, look each other in the eye, and find shared humanity over a simple cup of tea, what conversations are we too afraid to have today? What massive deadlocks in our own world are just sitting there, waiting for someone to take the first step, exactly halfway across the room? Think about that for a bit. Thanks so much for joining me on The Explainer today, and keep learning.